The first time I saw the HOA patrol officer in our backyard, I thought he was a burglar. I was washing dishes, looking out the kitchen window, when I spotted a man in a dark blue uniform scaling our 6-foot wooden fence. He dropped into our yard with surprising agility for someone his size, then pulled out a small camera and started taking pictures of our vegetable garden. I nearly dropped the plate I was washing. Without thinking, I ran outside, still holding a soapy sponge. "Hey, what are you doing in our backyard?" I shouted. The man turned around calmly, as if being caught trespassing was an everyday occurrence. He was middle-aged with a round face and a name tag that read Reynolds Pinewood Estates HOA. "Routine compliance inspection," he said, holding up a clipboard. "Your household has 3 violations that need to be documented." "Violations?" I stammered, looking around our perfectly normal backyard. "What violations? And why are you climbing our fence instead of knocking on the front door?" Reynolds ignored my second question. "Your vegetable garden exceeds the permitted size by approximately 30 square feet. Your garden hose is not the approved earth tone color. And..." He paused, pointing to my grandfather's handmade birdhouses hanging from our oak tree. "Those structures were not approved by the architectural committee." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We had lived in Pinewood Estates for almost 5 years, and while we knew there was an HOA, they had never been particularly strict. We paid our annual dues and kept our front yard neat. No one had ever mentioned anything about garden size restrictions or earth tone hoses. "Look, you can't just climb into people's yards without permission," I said, trying to stay calm. "That's trespassing." Reynolds smiled thinly. "Section 8.3 of the covenant you signed gives HOA representatives the right to inspect properties for violations. We try to do front yard inspections from the street, but backyards require a closer look." "By jumping our fence? Why not knock and ask permission?" "Experience shows that gives homeowners time to temporarily hide violations," he replied, as if that explained everything. He finished taking his photos and made some notes on his clipboard. "You'll receive formal violation notices within 3 days. You'll have 2 weeks to correct these issues before fines begin." With that, he walked to our fence, hoisted himself up with practiced ease, and disappeared over the top. I stood there, dripping soapy water onto the grass, feeling like I had just experienced some bizarre dream. When I went back inside, my grandfather was sitting at the kitchen table, frowning. My grandfather, Richard Carter, had moved in with us after my grandmother passed away last year. He was 76 years old, a retired electrical engineer with a sharp mind and sharper tongue. He had been working on one of his circuit projects at the table when the HOA officer appeared in our yard. "Did I just see some stranger climbing our fence?" he asked. I explained what had happened. With each detail, Grandpa's frown deepened. "They can't do that," he said firmly. "HOA or not, that's trespassing." "Does this happen often?" "I don't know," I admitted. "This is the first time I've seen it, but we're both at work during weekdays." He seemed pretty comfortable climbing the fence, like he's done it many times before. 3 days later, we received 3 separate violation notices in the mail, each detailing one of the infractions Reynolds had photographed. Each notice included a $50 processing fee and warned that failure to correct the violation within 2 weeks would result in daily fines of $25 per violation. My husband Mark and I were stunned. The total cost to process our violations was $150, more than our monthly HOA dues. "This is ridiculous," Mark said as we pored over the notices at dinner. "Since when does the HOA care about the color of our garden hose? And what's wrong with your birdhouses, Richard? They're beautiful." Grandpa had been unusually quiet during the conversation, but now he set down his fork. "The birdhouses aren't the issue," he said. "The issue is a stranger feeling entitled to climb into your private property without permission or warning. That's not right, and it's not legal regardless of what that covenant says." The next day Mark and I both had to work, but Grandpa said he would handle the situation. I assumed he meant he would call the HOA office to complain. I should have known better. When we came home that evening, Grandpa was sitting on the back porch, drinking iced tea and looking particularly satisfied with himself. "I took care of our little problem," he announced. "You talked to the HOA?" Mark asked hopefully. "Better than that," Grandpa replied. "I made some improvements to our security system." He led us to the back fence and pointed to a thin wire running along the top edge. It was barely visible unless you knew to look for it. "What is that?" I asked, though I was starting to guess. "That," Grandpa said proudly, "is a low-voltage electric fence. Completely legal under county code as a pet containment system. Not enough juice to cause any real harm, but more than enough to discourage fence climbers." Mark and I exchanged worried glances. You electrified our fence? I asked. Isn't that a bit extreme? Not at all, Grandpa said. It's the same voltage as those invisible pet fences. Won't cause any permanent damage, just a memorable surprise for anyone who touches it. And I added this. He pointed to a small sign he had placed on the inside of the fence. Caution, electric fence. HOA officers please use front door. The sign gives them fair warning, he explained. Legally we're covered. If they choose to climb over anyway, that's on them. I wasn't convinced this was the best approach, but Grandpa seemed so pleased with his solution that I didn't have the heart to argue. Besides, the chances of the HOA officer returning so soon seemed slim. I was wrong. The very next afternoon, I received a frantic call from our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chen. There's an ambulance in front of your house, she exclaimed. And a police car. Is everyone okay? I rushed home from work to find an ambulance, a police car, and a small crowd of neighbors gathered in our driveway. As I pulled up, the paramedics were loading someone on a stretcher into the ambulance. With a sinking feeling, I recognized the round face of Reynolds, the HOA patrol officer. A police officer approached me as I got out of my car. Are you the homeowner? He asked. I nodded, heart racing. What happened? Is that the HOA officer? Is he okay? He appears to have received an electric shock while climbing your back fence, the officer explained. Nothing life-threatening, but he fell and may have sprained his wrist. Can you tell me about the electric fence on your property? Before I could answer, Grandpa appeared from inside the house. Despite the seriousness of the situation, he looked completely calm. I installed that fence, he told the officer. It's a standard low-voltage pet containment system, fully compliant with County Code Section 14.2 regarding residential fencing. I'd be happy to show you the specifications and the warning sign I installed. The officer followed Grandpa to the backyard while I stood frozen in the driveway, wondering how a dispute over a garden hose had escalated to this point. When they returned, the officer was nodding. Everything appears to be in order with the fence itself, he said. The voltage is within legal limits for pet containment, and the warning sign is clearly visible. However, there may still be liability issues if the HOA employee was performing authorized duties. He was trespassing, Grandpa stated firmly. We never gave permission for anyone to climb our fence. If he had used the front door like a civilized person, this never would have happened. The officer made some notes and told us we might be contacted for further questions, but left without issuing any citations. The ambulance had already departed with Reynolds. By evening, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with the story. Several neighbors stopped by, ostensibly to make sure we were okay but really to get the juicy details. To my surprise, most of them were supportive. Reynolds climbed my fence last month, said Mrs. Taylor from 3 doors down. Scared me half to death when I saw him taking pictures of my patio furniture. He gave me a violation for my son's basketball hoop, added Mr. Rivera. Said it was 4 inches taller than regulations allow. How does that even affect anyone? It seemed Reynolds had been making quite a few enemies with his fence climbing inspections and petty violation notices. Far from being angry at Grandpa's electric fence, many neighbors were quietly amused that someone had finally stood up to the HOA's intrusive practices. The next morning, a certified letter arrived from the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association. I opened it with trembling hands, expecting a substantial fine or worse. Instead, it was a notice that emergency meetings had been called to discuss entry protocols for property inspections and revision of violation enforcement procedures. The letter also stated that all outstanding violations for our property had been placed under review. That afternoon, the president of the HOA herself came to our door. Victoria Spencer was a stern-looking woman in her 50s who had run the association for nearly a decade. Unlike Reynolds, she used the front door and rang the doorbell. I'd like to speak with you about yesterday's unfortunate incident, she said when I invited her in. Grandpa was sitting in the living room and didn't bother to get up when Victoria entered. Mr. Carter, she acknowledged him with a nod. I understand you're responsible for the HOA security modification to the property. If you mean the electric fence that your employee ignored despite clear warning signs, then yes, Grandpa replied. Victoria's lips tightened. Mr. Reynolds was performing his duties according to HOA guidelines. By trespassing? Grandpa asked. Does the HOA really believe that the covenant overrides basic property laws? Because I'd be very interested to have a judge weigh in on that question. Victoria shifted uncomfortably. The covenant does give us certain inspection rights. It may give you the right to inspect, Grandpa interrupted, but it doesn't specify climbing fences to do so. A normal person would knock on the front door and ask permission, or send a letter scheduling an inspection. Jumping fences is what burglars do, not legitimate officials. I expected Victoria to become angry, but instead she sighed. Mr. Carter, the HOA board has already voted to revise our inspection protocols. In retrospect, some of our enforcement methods have become overzealous. We're suspending all fence climbing inspections effective immediately. This was not what I had expected. So, our violations, I began, are being dismissed, Victoria confirmed, along with similar violations for all homeowners. We're also reviewing our rules regarding garden sizes and aesthetic requirements for items not visible from the street. She handed me an official letter confirming what she just said. We ask in return that you consider modifying your fence to prevent similar incidents in the future. Grandpa leaned forward. I'll remove the electric wire when the HOA formally amends the covenant to prohibit any representative from entering private property without the homeowner's permission or a court order. In writing as a binding amendment. Victoria hesitated, then nodded. I believe the board will agree to those terms. After she left, I turned to Grandpa in amazement. Did you plan this all along? To force them to change their rules? He smiled. Let's just say I've dealt with overreaching authorities before. Sometimes they need a little shock to remind them of boundaries, literal and figurative. 2 weeks later, every homeowner in Pinewood Estates received a copy of the newly amended covenant. Section 8.3 now explicitly stated that HOA representatives must obtain written permission before entering any private property, and all inspections must be scheduled at least 48 hours in advance. Reynolds was reassigned to office duties. The board created a new homeowner advisory committee to review all violation notices before they were sent out. And as promised, Grandpa removed the electric wire from our fence, though he kept the warning sign as a historical marker, he said with a wink. The most surprising change came a month later, when Victoria Spencer resigned as HOA president. In her place, the homeowners elected Mrs. Chin, our next-door neighbor, who ran on a platform of common-sense enforcement and respecting privacy. At her first meeting as president, Mrs. Chin asked Grandpa to join the architectural committee. We need someone who understands both technical specifications and personal boundaries, she told him. Grandpa accepted with a gracious nod. Happy to help, he said. But I hope you understand if I recuse myself from any decisions about garden hoses or birdhouses. The room erupted in laughter. By now, our story had become neighborhood legend, with various embellished versions circulating among homeowners. Some claimed the electric fence had shot sparks 10 feet into the air. Others insisted that Reynolds had been launched clean over the next fence by the shock. Grandpa never corrected these exaggerations, seeming to enjoy his new reputation as the neighborhood's defender against HOA tyranny. As for our garden, it continued to thrive at its excessive size. My husband replaced our non-regulation green hose with an earth tone brown one, but only because the old one had started leaking. And Grandpa's birdhouses still hang from our oak tree, now officially approved by the architectural committee he serves on. Sometimes, when new homeowners move into Pinewood Estates, they're puzzled by the oddly specific covenant rule about fence climbing and property entry. When they ask about it, they're usually directed to have a chat with Mr. Carter, the electrical engineer in the blue house. Grandpa is always happy to share the story, which has grown more colorful with each telling. The moral, he always concludes with a twinkle in his eye, is that good fences make good neighbors, but electric fences make better HOA policies. And no one in our HOA has climbed a fence since.